An order from General R.E. Lee, addressed to General D.H. Hill, which has accidentally come into my hands this evening, the authenticity of which is unquestionable, discloses some of the plans of the enemy and shows most conclusively that the main rebel army is now before us. With this incredible news, Union General George Brinton McClellan announced to Abraham Lincoln that he had scored what could easily be considered the intelligence coup of the war. Lee had entered Maryland 9 days earlier, with his sights set on the rich farmlands and vital rail centers in Pennsylvania. To secure his rear and cover a possible line of retreat, Lee dispersed 2/3 of his army into widely separated columns, with orders to converge on and capture the large federal garrison at Harper's Ferry. While doing this, the gray columns were vulnerable to attack, with little hope of support from the rest of the army. This was the situation when McClellan came into possession of Lee's orders. A rapid movement by the Federal Army across the South Mountain Range would place it squarely between the two sections of Lee's army, allowing McClellan to defeat them in detail. It was the kind of opportunity most Army commanders dream about, and there seemed little doubt that the Southern Army's days were numbered. McClellan himself confidently wired Lincoln that he would send him trophies. What actually happened was a classic example of the continually blundering leadership of the North and the resourcefulness and fighting spirit of the South. The confrontation taking shape in Maryland was not the first time that Robert E. Lee and George McClellan had faced each other. Just a few short months earlier, McClellan had been knocking at the gates of Richmond. He had pushed his 90,000 soldiers at a snail's pace up the peninsula, with the much smaller Confederate forces falling back before him. He stalled just outside the city as both sides prepared for the fiery collision that was inevitable. The Confederates attacked to relieve the pressure, but the attack only succeeded in wounding their commanding officer, Joseph Johnston, and achieved little else. That event proved momentous, however, as Johnston's place was taken by Lee, then a military advisor to Jefferson Davis and an unknown quantity in the field. Lee wasted little time in assaulting McClellan with everything he had. Though outnumbered, Lee so intimidated the Federal commander that he beat a hasty retreat to a new supply base at Harrison's Landing, 23 miles away. The campaign had been costly, more so for the Confederacy than the Union, but it had chased the Yankees from Richmond and made Lee a hero. It was now July 1862, 1 year since the first great clash at Manassas along the banks of Bull Run, and for the North, the war was not going well. In the East, they just could not seem to hold on to victory. Unable to prevail on the battlefield, Lincoln was also having difficulty with his cabinet, as some questioned his ability to lead. His frustration with McClellan caused him to seek elsewhere for a general who could lead the Federal troops to victory. With judgment born of desperation, he unwisely chose John Pope. Pope came from some minor successes on the Mississippi River, where the Union forces were faring somewhat better than in the East. In April, Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman were surprised in their camps near Shiloh Church by Albert Sidney Johnston's Confederates and nearly destroyed. But time and fortune seemed to favor the Yankees here. Grant was able to turn the tide the next day with fresh troops. Pope had been in charge of a small force assigned to clear the river of Confederate defenses. In this he had succeeded, and thus Lincoln fervently hoped he could repeat that success against Lee. Pope assumed command with all the bluster and arrogance of a man promoted beyond his level of competence. In his opening address to his new Eastern troops, he implied that the Western soldiers were braver than the men he now commanded, doing little to inspire loyalty among the ranks. He also issued a series of orders that gave his soldiers a free hand in ravaging the homes and farms of Virginia residents. These directives, considered barbaric by the Confederates, served to fuel their hatred as well of this bombastic political appointee. Thus, with enemies on both sides, John Pope set out to carry out Lincoln's plan to defeat Lee. Actually, Lincoln's plan was a sound one. He reasoned that McClellan's Army of the Potomac, although immobile at Harrison's Landing, would be too large a force to ignore, and would pin down a large number of Southern troops. If a second force, the Army of Virginia, could be organized and sent against Richmond from the north, the Confederates would not have enough men to hold McClellan and fight Pope. In theory, Lincoln was right. The combined forces of Pope and McClellan would number 150,000, nearly 3 times that of Lee. A coordinated assault from 2 sides would overwhelm the Southern forces and annihilate them or force them to surrender. Lincoln had other reasons to want the war ended quickly. The blockade of Southern ports that he had ordered when the war began was just now beginning to make itself felt. The shortage of cotton was being felt in Europe, and both France and England were teeming with pro-Confederate sentiment. Thousands of British textile workers were out of work, and hundreds of thousands more were threatened. The French were openly discussing sending their fleet to reopen the Mississippi and guarantee the free flow of cotton across the Atlantic. Lincoln's plan had better work soon, or the Federals might be facing armies from all of Europe. There was only one flaw in Lincoln's plan, and that was Lee. The new Confederate commander had already proven that he was willing to use unconventional tactics against his opponents. He had mercilessly attacked a superior and often fortified foe during the Peninsula Campaign, and had won. He had earlier sent Stonewall Jackson to keep Union forces in the Shenandoah off balance, and Jackson had proven his own brilliance and unpredictability by defeating several armies sent against him. These 2 men could hardly be expected to react passively as Lincoln gathered his hosts, or to be intimidated by superior numbers. With little difficulty, Lee discerned Lincoln's strategy. One of Lee's greatest assets was his ability to second-guess his opponent in battle, and he demonstrated that ability now. He guessed that the cautious McClellan would stay put, and that the man to worry about was Pope. He was right. McClellan had no love for John Pope, and was not inclined to assist him in any way, even when ordered to do so. Pope was having his own troubles with recalcitrant and incompetent subordinates. In general, the Union armies were in a sad state of disarray, and a coordinated assault of the type Lincoln was envisioning was a virtual impossibility. Nonetheless, Pope was advancing by fits and starts, and Lee had to act. Leaving Longstreet to face McClellan, Lee sent Jackson and A.P. Hill north to deal with Pope. While Pope bragged about success and glory in the advance, he fumbled attempts to concentrate his troops, and Jackson saw an opportunity to strike at the small and isolated corps of Nathaniel Banks, stationed just south of Culpeper, Virginia, near Slaughter Mountain. Banks and Jackson were also old antagonists, having tangled in the Shenandoah Valley during Jackson's classic campaign there. Banks was now under orders to arrest Jackson's advance, and he had no intention of repeating his earlier failures. Thus it was that when Jackson's force appeared on his front, August the 9th, 1862, Banks attacked without knowing the odds. Banks' men fought with spirit, and the battle went well for them in its early stages. Two of his brigades surprised the Confederates on their left flank, driving them back in confusion. For a time, it seemed as though Banks would get his revenge. But the odds against Banks were high. Jackson started the battle with only half his men on the field. The other half, under A.P. Hill, were now arriving. 12,000 fresh Confederates, 1.5 times as many as Banks had started with, now descended upon his weary and weakened men. There was no escape. They fell back, at first in good order, but soon the retreat became a full-scale panic. The hapless Banks would not have his revenge today, or any day, for that matter. The defeat galvanized Pope. His forces were quickly consolidated and stationed along the Rapidan River. Whereas Pope had begun the campaign as the aggressor, it was now Lee who had the initiative, and he had no intention of giving it up. By now it had become apparent to Lincoln that McClellan was going nowhere on the peninsula, and he ordered him to begin transferring his men back to Washington on transport ships. This McClellan was reluctant to do, not wanting to turn his men over to Pope and seeking to maintain some opportunity for himself. Eventually, however, he had no choice, and his men began embarking for the trip north. This was immediately reported to Lee, who realized that he could now reunite his army faster than the Federals could unite Pope and McClellan. Longstreet was ordered north, and Lee began looking for a way to penetrate Pope's line. None could be found, however, and so Lee resorted to a favorite tactic. Jackson and Hill set off on a 50-mile flanking march around Pope's right flank, while Longstreet fooled Pope into believing that the whole Confederate army was still in front of him. Suddenly came the news that Jackson had raided and destroyed Manassas Junction, Pope's primary supply depot, and then disappeared from sight. Embarrassed and enraged, Pope turned and pursued Jackson, but could not find him. While Pope marched and countermarched in search of Stonewall, Lee followed Jackson's flanking route with Longstreet's corps. Soon the Southern Army would be reunited in Pope's front, and on a battleground of their own choosing. McClellan was dragging his heels in returning to Washington, and it seemed that only a few of his troops would be available to assist Pope. In accordance with Lee's original intentions, when Longstreet was reported to be within a day's march of Jackson's hidden position, the crafty Stonewall revealed himself to the Federals. Pouncing on an unsuspecting Union division, he alerted Pope, who ordered every unit to converge on the site immediately. Within hours, the scattered pieces of his army had collected on the old battlefield of Bull Run. 55,000 Federals now faced Jackson's 25,000, who had established a fine defensive position behind an unfinished railroad embankment. For the next 24 hours, Pope's troops battered Jackson's line, sometimes bending it, but never quite breaking it. Jackson's beleaguered men fought doggedly against the gallant and spirited attacks of the Union troops. Time and again they threw back the assaults that came within a hair's breadth of breaking through. While this holocaust was raging along Jackson's line, Longstreet's corps arrived, and Lee placed them on Jackson's right, forming a rough L around the attacking Federals. Amazingly, Pope ignored reports from his patrols and pickets and focused all his attention on Jackson. 30,000 Confederates stood in position for a full day without being detected. The next day, Pope massed his troops for one final push against Jackson. Assisted now by Longstreet's artillery, Jackson blunted this attack. As the Yankees' momentum slackened, Longstreet surged forward. The only unit facing this onslaught were two Zouave regiments, the 5th and 10th New York Volunteers. Bravely they stood against the gray tide, and bravely they died. Within 20 minutes, 300 of the 500 members of the 5th New York were down, and the remainder fled, saving their colors. Longstreet's attack rolled on, crashing into the flank of Pope's now exhausted men. The organization of whole units ceased to exist, and a confused and terrified mass ran for safety. The regular army troops of George Sykes stemmed the tide, with the assistance from others not overrun already. As the day waned, the Confederate attack did also, and the night brought blessed relief to the battle-weary men of both sides. There was no disputing it. The Federals had been outmarched and outgeneraled again, and Pope knew it. His situation was summed up by one of his soldiers, who wrote that Pope, quotes, had been kicked, cuffed, hustled about, knocked down, run over, and trodden upon as rarely happens in the history of war, and in the end he was glad to find a refuge in the entrenchments of Washington, from which he had sallied forth 6 weeks before, breathing out threatenings and slaughter, unquote. Within a month, Pope was reassigned to Minnesota to fight Indians, and the little Napoleon McClellan found himself in overall command again as Lee and his legions crossed the Potomac into Yankee territory, and panic began to grip the hearts of Pennsylvania farmers. It did not take Lee long to discover that McClellan had a copy of his orders. A sympathetic citizen of Frederick had been present in McClellan's tent when the dispatch had been brought in, and reported it quickly to Jeb Stuart. It was almost 18 hours before McClellan's men moved to close in on the scattered Confederates, giving them precious time. Lee, realizing his predicament was serious, was not so slow, and quickly took steps to minimize the danger. He ordered the closest elements of his army under D.H. Hill to hold the passes of South Mountain, while he sought to consolidate the balance of his forces at Sharpsburg. Hill, with help from Jeb Stuart's cavalry, deployed to try to hold back the massive numbers of bluecoats heading their way. The odds were heavily stacked against the Confederates, but their defense was crucial to the survival of the Army of Northern Virginia. Grimly, they dug in. South Mountain can be crossed in 3 places: Turner's Gap, Fox's Gap, and Crampton's Gap. The first of these was the principal target of McClellan's advance, and where Lee mounted his stiffest defense. The first Federals to arrive were a group of Ohioans under Jacob Cox. They turned aside from the direct road and flanked the southern position through Fox's Gap. The defenders there fought fiercely, holding the advance back for 2 hours. In the middle of the fight, the Confederate commander Samuel Garland was mortally wounded. The loss of their leader and the superior Union strength finally won the day for Cox. Exhausted but victorious, his division pressed on towards Turner's Gap to the north. D.H. Hill was being pressed hard, and help was still hours away. He employed his artillery and every able-bodied man he could muster to hold the line until help could arrive. McClellan was surprised by the stubbornness of the defense and called in his own reinforcements. Soon the entire Federal Army of the Potomac would be on hand to confront only about a dozen brigades of Confederates. For hours, units on both sides arrived piecemeal and went into action against each other. The fighting lasted most of the day, with no advantage being gained by either side, until McClellan ordered Hooker's entire corps to swing north and outflank the southern position. John Gibbon's Iron Brigade was ordered to attack straight on as a diversion. Their attack was relentless and unswerving, but the Confederate defense was ferocious, and the Union men were unsuccessful. Hooker's men completed their flanking march and pressed in hard on Robert Rodes' Confederates. 2 divisions against 1 lone brigade. Rodes' troops fought like tigers, and Hooker advanced only slowly.
Against the wall, man. OG! Right here, man! Got him! Fifth Company, low!
At Crampton's Gap, several miles south, resistance was lighter. The quiet town of Burkittsville stood at the base of the mountain, and it was soon swarming with bluecoats. William Franklin's 12,000 Yankees hurled themselves at Thomas Munford's 1,000 Confederates. It was no contest. The Southern troops gave up the fences and stone walls they defended and retreated up the side of the mountain. Union attackers quickly took possession of South Mountain, and the way was clear for Franklin's troops to move to the relief of Harper's Ferry. Franklin stalled, however, at the sight of Lafayette McLaws' brigade drawn up in the valley beyond the mountain, and the opportunity slipped away with the daylight. The defense of South Mountain had been costly for the Confederates. Of 18,000 men engaged, they had lost 2,700, including 800 missing. The Federals had utilized about 28,000 troops and counted only 1,800 losses. Reviewing the events of the day, Lee actually decided to cancel his invasion plans and withdraw back into Virginia. But news from Stonewall Jackson changed his mind. The valiant fight on the mountain slopes had given Stonewall the time he needed to surround Harper's Ferry. The next day, the Federal garrison there surrendered, and Lee ordered Jackson's men to reunite with Longstreet at Sharpsburg. It was September the 15th, 1862, and never was the Army of Northern Virginia closer to defeat. The Southern Army was badly outnumbered and still scattered. Banking on McClellan's caution once again, Lee pulled in his wings, took up position on the west side of Antietam Creek, dug in to wait for Jackson, and prepared to fight. The hills Lee had chosen were west of a tiny hamlet in western Maryland called Sharpsburg, and only a few miles from the Potomac River. Once deployed, his men would have the river at their backs, and only one usable ford within marching distance. There would be no escape if defeated. But the terrain was well suited for defense. Stretching about 4 miles from a bend in the Potomac to the lower bridge on Antietam Creek, the ground was covered with rail and stone fences, waist-high outcroppings of limestone, wooded areas, and even a sunken road. Properly utilized, this kind of cover would help to balance the odds. And the odds were daunting. McClellan counted 70,000 men of all arms and 300 artillery pieces to throw against Lee. Even after all his forces were reunited, Lee would have only about 40,000 men and 200 artillery. He would be relying heavily on his ability to shift troops to meet the Federal assaults. The townsfolk of Sharpsburg, surrounded by 2 armies, took shelter in their basements, although at least 200 left town and hid in a large cave to ride out the storm. Again, McClellan missed an opportunity to crush Lee. On September 15th, Lee had only 18,000 men in position, while McClellan's army numbered nearly 60,000 that same day. But the cautious McClellan postponed the attack until the morning of the 17th, by which time almost all of Lee's army had arrived. Little Mac's battle plan was a good one, on paper at least. It called for the 3 corps of Hooker, Mansfield, and Sumner to strike at Lee's left flank, while Burnside's corps attacked the Confederate right at the lower bridge. This latter attack was intended to prevent Lee from shifting troops from that flank to assist the other. Fitzjohn Porter's corps and Alfred Pleasonton's cavalry would remain in reserve near the center, ready to exploit any breakthrough. Facing these assaults would be Stonewall Jackson on the Confederate left flank and Longstreet on the right. Stuart's cavalry and artillery covered the narrow strip between Jackson and the Potomac. A.P. Hill's Light Division and those of McLaws and Richard Anderson were still en route from Harper's Ferry. The latter 2 arrived just after dawn on the 17th, but Hill was not yet on the field. Jackson's 7,700 men stood waiting for the onslaught of Hooker's 9,000 and Mansfield's 7,500. As the dawn broke, Hooker's men went forward in the deep mist, Abner Doubleday's men on the right and George Meade's men on the left.
Commence fire! Second company, hey! Fire! Oh! Fire!
They collided with Stonewall's men in Miller's cornfield, and the fighting was severe. The fighting was so intense that units on both sides quickly racked up casualty rates of 30, 40, and even 50%. Isaac Hall of the 97th New York commented that the two sides stood and shot one another until the lines melted away like wax. Both sides rushed reinforcements into this fight, which surged back and forth through the cornfield and the rolling meadows on all sides of it.
I'm warning you now! Got an artillery.
Gradually, the Confederates were forced back. Just when it looked as though the Union troops would break the line, John Bell Hood's division burst through the shattered Confederate line. Mad as hornets for being interrupted during their first hot meal in days, Hood's men stopped the Federal advance cold and counterattacked. Exhausted, low on ammunition, and surprised by Hood's aggressiveness, the Yankees fell back. Pursuing recklessly, the Texas Brigade became separated, with the 1st Texas ahead of the main line by 150 yards. Waiting Federals opened up on them from front and flank as they came into range. In about 20 minutes, 186 of 226 men were killed or wounded, a casualty rate of 82.3%, the highest of any unit during the entire war. Hood had smashed Hooker's attack and knocked the 1st Corps out of the fight for the rest of the day. He had saved the Confederate left, for the moment. But new threats were developing. Mansfield's 12th Corps now swung into action. Containing many raw recruits, Mansfield's divisions rolled into the East Woods, where they were met by Hood's troops, now defending the cornfield. Their advance was stopped by the determined resistance, and casualties piled up as the two sides slugged it out. The stalemate was broken when George Greene's 2 Federal brigades burst through a gap in the Confederate line. Flanking the defenders, he forced them back through the corn, leaving the dead piled high. His men pushed all the way to the Dunker Church before heavy fire caused them to halt. As Greene sent back for ammunition, there was a sudden lull in the conflict. In 3 hours, 8,000 Americans had been killed or wounded in the savage fighting. Despite McClellan's orders, Ambrose Burnside had failed to launch the diversionary attack at the bridge, and Lee had been able to counter the initial Federal assaults by shifting men from the flank Burnside was supposed to be tying down. At approximately 9 a.m., McClellan finally gave orders to the 3rd and Final Corps under Edwin Sumner to cross the Antietam and attack the Confederate left. Sumner hurried 2 divisions under William French and John Sedgwick into the fray. He formed Sedgwick's brigades into 3 lines of battle and surged forward. In his haste to get into battle, he left French's men behind. When they arrived and found no one, they veered off to where Greene's men were holding on near Dunker Church. This left Sumner with only Sedgwick's 4,500 men to make the assault. Sumner advanced across the Hagerstown Pike and into the West Woods, where his first line encountered Stewart's artillery and a handful of Jackson's men. A lively firefight began, and the two rear brigades relaxed while this got underway. Suddenly, Lee's reinforcements from the other flank arrived on the Federal left and rear. They opened fire with murderous effect, and the Yankee line quickly dissolved. In less than 20 minutes of intense combat, nearly half of Sedgwick's men were added to the casualty lists, and the rest were in flight. McClellan's attacks on this portion of the battlefield were finished, but the slaughter was far from over. French's errant division, swinging wide to the left of Sedgwick's line of advance, headed towards the sunken road and D.H. Hill's Confederates. Hill's men waited, mostly concealed, until the Yankees were just cresting the hill, only 100 yards to their front. Hill counted only 2,500 troops, about half of the attacking force, but they were veterans, well commanded, and well entrenched. As French's 1st Brigade started down the hill, the Confederates opened up in their faces, blasting the attacking line to pieces, and the Federals fell back. French sent in his other 2 brigades, and they suffered the same fate. General Israel Richardson's Federal Division came up on the left and joined the attack. For 2 hours the killing continued, and the dead and wounded on both sides piled up. The 4th North Carolina lost every one of its officers, and the Confederate line began to waver. Finally, through a misunderstood order and some skillful Federal maneuvering, Robert Rodes' Confederates turned and headed for the rear. The gap in the line was quickly filled by Federals, and soon the rest of the Confederates withdrew. For a short time, there was nothing between the Union forces and the Confederate rear but a few disorganized troops and a couple of artillery pieces. Longstreet was desperately rounding up every gun he could find. This artillery eventually halted the Federals just beyond the sunken road. Having lost 1,000 men, Richardson reluctantly ordered his men to retire, while he sought artillery to counter the 20 guns that Longstreet had assembled. While this was going on, Richardson was mortally wounded by an exploding shell, and the Federal momentum was lost on this part of the field. McClellan had yet another opportunity to crush Lee. He had 23,000 fresh troops within easy marching distance of the sunken road, as well as 3,500 cavalry. The Confederates' regiments and brigades were shattered and disorganized. Only Longstreet's cannon stood in the way. But McClellan's extreme caution prevented him from acting decisively. Perhaps the fierceness of the Confederate defense had intimidated him. Lee had gambled everything, but McClellan would risk nothing. The attacks on the Confederate left and center sputtered out. Sometime after 10 a.m., Ambrose Burnside finally got his attack over the Rohrsbach Bridge underway. He understood his role to be diversionary, however, and thus launched a series of uncoordinated small-scale assaults with one brigade after another over the narrow bridge, which would hereafter be known as Burnside's Bridge. The Confederates occupied a strong position on the high bluffs opposite the bridge. Though they numbered only 600, the strength of their defensive position more than made up for the disparity in numbers. Burnside's half-hearted attempts to cross the bridge only resulted in more casualties. Hours passed with no progress being made against the heavily outnumbered Confederates. Finally, the order went out to the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania under Colonel Edward Ferrero. Ferrero promised to return the two regiments' whiskey ration if they took the bridge. Packed into tight columns, they raced down the hill and onto the bridge with the colors in the lead. The Confederates, under Robert Toombs, knew that the time had come to depart. Low on ammunition and informed that a Federal flanking force had crossed the river south of their position and would soon flank them, they withdrew. They had held up the Federal advance for 3 hours, time that would prove crucial. Burnside's men did not immediately exploit their advantage. Though virtually no Confederates stood between them and Sharpsburg, they were low on ammunition, and the division commanders reported their men tired. Fresh troops were ordered forward to replace them, and a delay of several hours resulted as these men worked their way to the front. Lee had no reserves left. Every man had been committed, and all were exhausted from the most devastating fighting they had ever seen. Unit organizations were destroyed, and it seemed that nothing would stand between the Union advance and the Confederates' only line of retreat through Sharpsburg. The few regiments that were in position to resist were small, less than 100 men each, and they were supported only by several artillery pieces. Against these, Burnside arrayed 8,000 men and 22 cannon, mostly fresh troops. The Confederates, as they had done all day, fought ferociously. Stubbornly falling back, they held on as best they could, but they could not hope to hold for long against such odds, and the Federals closed to the outskirts of Sharpsburg. Then, about 3:30 p.m., a column of men was seen approaching from the southwest. At first, Lee thought he had been cut off from the Potomac, and that the end had come. Then an aide told him that the flags they carried were Virginia and Confederate flags. A.P. Hill had finally arrived from Harper's Ferry and was in perfect position to rescue the Southern right. Hill had only 3,000 of his division left in the ranks after a grueling march that had brought them 17 miles in 8 hours. Still, they were all Lee had, and they would serve the purpose. Quickly, they filed into line and pitched into the advancing Yankees. Caught by surprise, the Federal attack disintegrated, and the units fell back to the bridge. Lee had held, in spite of incredible odds against him. His men had fought like demons, and McClellan was never able to coordinate his attacks and bring his superior strength to bear. Fully 30,000 Union troops never took part in the battle, held back in expectation of the counterattack that would never come. As the sun slowly set in the west, the fighting tapered off to an occasional sputter of picket firing, and the exhausted men on both sides collapsed on their arms. 23,000 casualties littered the field. It had been the bloodiest single day in American military history. 9 Confederate generals and 9 Federal generals had fallen in scarcely 12 hours' time. It was a day that would live on in the memories and the nightmares of those who were there for years to come. Much has been said about the dead, and much has been said of those who march away to fight another day. But what of those who do not march away and are not buried? What was their fate? Some would accompany the rest of the army, and many would be left behind. It fell to the forces that remained in possession of the field to bury the dead and care for the wounded of both sides that had not been transported away. For these wounded men, the hospital was often a place of little comfort. The science of medicine was not up to the overwhelming task of administering to thousands of horribly mangled and suffering men. Qualified doctors were in short supply, and the wounded often lay on the battlefield for days awaiting attention. Those that were brought in received only cursory care from the overworked and exhausted hospital staff. Many died waiting for someone to attend to their needs.
Blood's not stopping. It's flowing. Blood's not stopping. It's flowing.
For thousands, the surgery consisted of amputation. Performed literally in a few minutes, amputation was the quickest and easiest solution to wounds that shattered bones. About 1 man in 3 would not survive the experience, and those that did frequently had complications arise later from infection or improperly performed surgical procedures. Many of the soldiers felt that the dead were the more fortunate. The Civil War hospital was a grim and disheartening place. It is not surprising that many a wounded man slipped off to the peace of eternal rest in such an environment. For Lee, his first invasion of Northern Territory was over. With casualties of 25%, there was no possibility of continuing the march north. Reluctantly, he recrossed the Potomac and retreated back into Virginia. The opportunity to win European support for the Confederacy seemed more remote than ever, and indeed would never come. The only real gain had been the large quantity of military stores taken at Harper's Ferry. For McClellan, he was satisfied with the victory he felt he had won. Despite the immediate availability of 30,000 fresh troops, he did not pursue the retreating rebels. Lincoln was furious and demanded that he advance and destroy Lee. McClellan protested that his men and horses were fatigued and he could not advance. Lincoln visited him on the battlefield to see for himself, taking time to console the wounded. Shortly after this, Lincoln replaced McClellan for the last time with Ambrose Burnside. Lincoln also took advantage of what he saw as the closest thing to a victory he was going to get to make a political maneuver designed to keep Europe out of the war. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, setting all the slaves in the rebellious states free. This gesture made the war a war against slavery, and England and France were unlikely to fight to defend slavery. Thus, with a stroke of the pen, Lincoln ended the threat of European intervention and gave the weary Yankees a new cause to fight for. It would take the Yankee Army to make the words a reality for most slaves, but the concept of freedom was a powerful one, and before long, thousands of slaves would be following Yankees wherever they went. Lee would try again, a year later, to take the war north, but for now, he would have to be content to let the war come to him, and it would before very long. The next great clash would come in December, just 3 short months away. Until then, the Southern Army would lick its wounds, fill its ranks, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the Army of the Potomac.